Well, good afternoon. My name is John Seidel. I am director of Krannert Art Museum, but I'm actually standing in front of you now in my guise as Amy Powell, curator of modern and contemporary art here at CAM, who was originally slated to do the introduction and who's watching from home. So I'm delighted to introduce our colleague and Amy's sometimes co-conspirator, Maryam Kashani. A filmmaker, anthropologist, and activist, Kashani's work models the intersections of thinking and doing. Her work focuses on theories and theologies of liberation, geography, race, Islam, visual culture, and social movements. Her book project, forthcoming from Duke University Press and apparently in the last throes of editing, titled Medina by the Bay, The Ethics of Knowledge and Survival in the Bay Area, is based on ethnographic research and filmmaking conducted among Muslim communities in the greater San Francisco Bay Area. Her films and video installations have been presented internationally at sites including Los Angeles Asian Pacific Film Festival, the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, the Hammer Museum at UCLA, the 12th Sharjah Biennial, 98 Weeks in Beirut, and the Pacific Film Archive at Berkeley. Maryam is assistant professor in the departments of Gender and Women's Studies and Asian American Studies here at the University of Illinois, though she rejoins us today from her current year's leave as research fellow at the Yale Center for the Study of Race, Indigeneity, and Transnational Migration. In New Haven, she's working with composer and musician Wadada Leo Smith on the 10 Freedom Summers film project, which examines ongoing relationships in the struggles for Black freedom, music, and religion. Maryam is also an organizer with Believers Bail Out, a community-led effort to bail out Muslims in pretrial and immigration incarceration towards abolition. I welcome Maryam Kashani for a paper and dialogue with Hal Fischer's work and her research in the Bay Area, Soul of the City, The Struggles for San Francisco.
How do I advance? And so I just use the arrows.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Okay. Thank you, John. Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Tim, for having me here. Maybe from the introduction, people are like, what is she doing here? What is she going to talk about? But I'm actually really excited to talk about Hal's work. So I'll just get on in. And this is really an introduction to thinking about Hal's work and where I enter. I think, as a number of speakers have already said, there's so much to be said, so I'm still trying to figure out which angle I'm coming at this work with. And of course, thank you, Hal, for the work. So the first time I saw the photographs of Hal Fischer, they felt like coming home, as they propelled a rush of memories and images of growing up in San Francisco in the 1980s and 90s. And I could definitely speak to a certain amount of pleasure that I receive from the photographs. Seeing the gay Semiotics series reminded me of junior high conversations with friends who likewise discussed the semiotics of gayness, if only to distinguish that their earrings were worn on the ears that signified straight or gay, as the case may be. I remembered telling my parents we were going trick-or-treating in the neighborhood, but really jumping on the train and going to Castro for the epic Halloween street party. The feeling of coming up the stairs from Castro Street Muni Station, 2 stations away from my sleepy neighborhood, with excitement and anticipation, not only on Halloween, but rather all the time. My sister's first job was at the new Ben & Jerry's, where she developed superhuman right arm strength. And I would often wander around, meander through the bookstore nearby while I waited for her to get off work. She would go on to actually work at an AIDS hospice as well as a teenager, losing a lot of really wonderful people. I went to a Jesuit high school, not as a Catholic, and in the early 90s, my classmates and I initiated conversations about race and sexuality and reached out to local LGBTQ plus organizations to come make presentations for our then unfortunately titled Tolerance Week. I had a similar memory feeling reading Rabi Alameddine's Kool-Aids, a novel of San Francisco at the height of the AIDS epidemic that juxtaposed the fear, livingness, and loss of that moment with the simultaneous civil war in Lebanon. I remembered growing up with the ominousness of the AIDS epidemic, together with the war on drugs, an early consciousness about blood, our bodies, and our brains on drugs. When an HIV-positive kindergartner entered my Catholic elementary school in the 1980s, we were all assembled to discuss what HIV and AIDS were and how we would care for him and ourselves should he get hurt in the classroom or on the school playground. Along with all that were the hijackings of planes, Iran-Contra, and the 1980s reign of San Francisco 49ers football. I share these brief memories to say something about the larger socio-political milieu of San Francisco from which these images, my memories, and Fischer's photographs emerge. How I do not see queer youth of color in his work or amongst his boyfriends. Fischer's life seems pretty white and Eurocentric. At the same time, because his work documents a significant coalescing of forces centered around his own experience of living, connecting, and creating in the city, that ultimately shapes so much of the city's energy, conflicts, struggles, aura, its limits and possibilities. I see and make home in these images, perhaps not meant for me, but that also helped raise and make me, and all the other city kids that grew up within and amidst what was happening in the Tenderloin and on Polk Street, the Castro, the Upper and Lower Haight, and south of Market. I was telling him a little bit earlier today whether or not they liked it. These guys were our uncles. The majority of Fischer's work documents the transitional decade of the 1970s, the tail end of civil unrest and revolution towards the recapture of power, downtown redevelopment, and conservative backlash that came with economic downturn, the oil crisis, and the Reagan era that started in 1968 in California. My dad had gas stations in San Francisco, and he says everything started to change during the 1973 oil crisis. The zebra murders of 1973 to 74 had just ended right before he got there. Harvey Milk is elected in 77, assassinated in 78. The mass death of the People's Temple community in Jonestown would happen in 78. The struggle for the International Hotel in Manila Town, which culminated in the eviction of all tenants in 1977, which I'll talk a little bit about later. Like, this was all happening. The 70s was a very busy time. These works also demonstrate how people were continuing to arrive, physically and figuratively, creating ways of living, communicating, and being with each other in private and in full view. So I've been documenting a changing San Francisco since I first started taking pictures with the Polaroid camera I got for my 9th or 10th birthday. I eventually evolved to my mother's Minolta SRT 101, documenting my motley crew of homegirls and boys in the Bay Area. We were mostly young people of color, born and raised in San Francisco and Oakland, to parents who had migrated to the Bay Area and other parts of the United States or from abroad. They too arrived with freedom dreams and made space in the 46.9 square mile peninsula bordered by water on 3 sides that was the city and the larger Bay Area around it. I would leave the Bay Area for Los Angeles in 2000 to go to film school, but soon returned to the Bay Area to film the places where my father and his friends, who had emigrated from Iran in the 1960s and 70s, first lived, worked, and started businesses. Many of the bars, restaurants, and nightclubs that they worked in and started were now Thai and Vietnamese restaurants, charting the different waves of immigration and entrepreneurship in the city. If I were to go back to the sites now that I had filmed in the early 2000s, 20 years later, I know that these sites will have again changed ownership and purpose. The 76 gas station on Ocean Avenue in Ingleside that my father ran for 20 years is gone now in his condos. I recognize that attention to temporality and the transformations of space in Fischer's 18th Near Castro 24 series. The cycles of a day charted the shifting rhythms of public life and demography that my work charts over decades. Is that bench still there? Are compromises still being made as people jostle for a seat to rest aging limbs or a spot to catch precious rays of midday sun? I'm caught by Fischer's caption at 10 a.m., which I don't have, so you're looking at 11 a.m., how the old men ignore him being, quote, used to anything occurring in the Castro. Fischer articulates how, quote, once this was their neighborhood. Now it's the largest gay enclave in the world. The working class bars the men frequented are gay now, and their gathering points have turned into cruise areas. The rents have doubled and tripled, and the bakeries, hardware stores, and barbershops have been transformed into kitchen emporiums, clothing boutiques, and restaurants. That's the end of that quote. The young men who later crowd the old at the bench and on the wall in Fischer's narratives of going to the bookstore, restaurant, bar, and coffee and donut shops would have had a similar experience decades later, as they now witness the transitions from what once was to what now is. Fischer's description describes gentrification processes that would occur throughout the city over the next 40 years, and in most cities across the country and increasingly across the globe as well. While it didn't always feel like it, from the 70s to the 90s, the country was actually growing closer together racially after the uprisings of the 60s, as public schools in the Bay Area reached a peak of integration in 1989. At the same time, the gaps between rich and poor would begin to widen in this period as well, exponentially, while the entire Bay Area now has become much more segregated. So I want to talk more at some point about Hal's ethnographic impulse, right? And how that combines with humor, vulnerability, ambivalence, thinking about bodies in relation, and also the real filmic quality of the serial works, as we have an image, but we also have commentary, a kind of disembodied voiceover as text, which makes me wish there were more funny essay films and documentaries generally in circulation. They tend to be so serious and sentimental, and I am rather serious and sentimental in this paper as well, so just please forgive me for that. I'm struck by the way Fischer anticipates the reflexive turn in ethnographic writing, right? In the way he thinks about what kind of sort of quote unquote voiceover, what kind of voice he gives as captions to his photographs, and how he's really playing with this idea of how we read photographs, right? And I also think in this sort of reflexive turn, there's also a question of ethics in terms of the power to classify and how humor and the insertion of the self restructures those relations, undermining the potentiality of the omnipotent authoritative voice, right? So there's a certain power and, power knowledge, as Foucault would say, in terms of how we're categorizing and organizing and labeling. And I really think that the way Hal approaches this really plays with that power relationship of sort of knowledge production about a group of people, about the different tribes of San Francisco. So Fischer speaks of the influence of San Francisco photographer Jack Fulton, and so you obviously see, if you've been able to go to the exhibit upstairs, some of the influence of that. And I'm hoping to look more into Jack Fulton's work and try to make these connections, right? Because housework is very much about what was happening in San Francisco at this time in photography. And so we can see the relationship of text and image happening here and the kind of storytelling narrative and anti-narrative that's happening in this of Jack Fulton's work, but also where I am going to go next. Let's see. And I was thinking to myself as I was admonishing my own sentimentality and seriousness in this paper that maybe if I still lived in San Francisco, the paper would be more tongue-in-cheek. So I returned again to the Bay Area from 2010 to 2012 to conduct ethnographic research amongst Muslim communities of the Bay Area. So in my book, Medina by the Bay, I have this paragraph about the context of writing that book from that 2-year period of ethnographic research, as well as, quote, a longer history of growing up in and being in relation to the Bay and its lapsed and devoted Muslims, lapsed and devoted Catholics, Jews, Christians, and Buddhists, atheists and agnostics, Maoists and Marxists, red diaper babies, activists, artists, queers, straights, studs, dykes, fags, hippies, trannies and trans people, criminals and the criminal-minded, the haves, the have-nots, Indians and Native Americans, Mexicans, hella Filipinos, Black folk, Chinese folk, mixed kids, racists, living legends and legacies, hip-hop heads and punks, preppies, family, everyone God has willed and created. And I think based from the last paper, thinking about the uncommensurable, but also how these things become commensurable in a kind of unutopic, dissonant kind of place that San Francisco has been. That paragraph I wrote in a book, which is probably not going to be found in any other book about Islam, looks at Bay Area Muslim communities as a microcosm for the Bay Area more broadly, speaks to San Francisco's history as vanguard, refuge, and anomaly that sets it apart from so much of the rest of the country. San Francisco's complexity is its gravity. It keeps pulling me back to peel back its layers of the untold, its warnings, its lessons. How so many stories and struggles come together and apart in the contestations of nation, capital, ethnicity and race, sexuality, religion, and politics that has also marked it as a critical battleground in our collective histories and futures. And I think Hal's work also really gets at this way in which the street corner, the park bench are really these places of encounter, right? Where people confront each other, encounter each other, reach out to each other, as I was saying before, and really thinking through what are those limits and possibilities that make those encounters possible and the good and bad that might come from those encounters, right? San Francisco as a refuge, as a site of freedom dreaming, also functions as settler colonial myth-making, summoning us to forget its genocidal past at the same time as its name commemorates it, right? St. Francis of Assisi. The original inhabitants, stewards, and relatives of the lands and waters of San Francisco, the Ramaytush Ohlone, as well as the Miwok, Yokuts, and Patwin, and other Ohlone peoples of the greater Bay Area continue to struggle for the rematriation of and care for the lands, waters, and inhabitants. This ongoing struggle calls upon us who settle and make lives in these stolen and unceded places to consider our responsibilities of being in geographic proximity at the same time as we refuse or accept to come to terms with our collective extinction and loss when San Francisco sinks into the Pacific and the trees all burn down, when we can no longer breathe the air or drink the water. I told you this was going to be serious. So Fischer's eviction from 1975 captures San Francisco as vanguard, refuge, and anomaly. Its housing struggles and the relationality inherent in the way he marks and maps this image. while eviction frames this moment humorously as a game, as in Name That Revolutionary. In the somber, emphatic, and accusatory looks captured in the face of an unknown revolutionary, the quote-unquote supportive cop as intermediary, and the glib landlord, Fischer also conveys the intensity of the confrontation and the attempt of the landlord to put the tenant of apartment 104 out on the street. The cast of characters stand in for a larger drama between the propertied, the police who protect and serve them, and populations ranging from white revolutionaries and organizers to those not pictured in this frame. Amongst those not pictured but present behind the camera was Hal Fischer himself, a tenant and co-organizer of his neighbors at 10 Lyon Street in the Haight-Ashbury. And in case anyone wants to know, apartment 208 is currently available at 10 Lyon Street. It is a 1-bedroom, 1-bathroom that is currently available for $2,600.95, and that's actually a deal.
I paid $140.
Yeah. Yeah, so Hal was a graduate student studying photography at San Francisco State at the time, and you were facing a $120 rent hike, right? From $180 to $300, and potential eviction, as the militant tenants had all deducted from their rent the 14 days they had lived without heat and water that previous September. And this is a wonderful article all about it, featuring Hal in the Berkeley Barb. A growing movement for tenants' rights had been developing throughout the 1970s as economic and demographic shifts made for less affordable housing for more people. As the Berkeley Barb article about the police, landlord, and tenant confrontation says, quote, "For low-income persons, only one apartment they can afford in 100 will be vacant at any given moment. For moderate income persons, only 2 in 100 will be available." At the same time, a history of redlining had limited who could live where, so African Americans were squeezed into dense and eventually overpopulated areas of the city, as well as Oakland, East Palo Alto, and Marin City in the East, South, and North Bays, respectively. Beatniks and artists had moved from North Beach to the edges of the Western Addition toward the center of the city, where white flight to Bay Area suburbs and the West Side made old Victorian houses available in the Haight-Ashbury, which would become the center of the Summer of Love, the Castro, the gay Mecca, and the Mission, the heart of Latinx life, as well as leftist, feminist, and third world politics, and which would become ground zero for 21st century battles for the city. The Tenderloin was termed the white ghetto, so far as it was identified with vice, deviance, and disorder, sex work, single mothers, promiscuity, drug use, non-conventional gender, and homosexuality. Although from the 1950s onwards, activists worked to promote what Christina Hanhart describes as homosexuality, quote, as a respectable form of sexual non-normativity, one disassociated from the criminalized and disorderly of the city, insofar as it was associated with whiteness, end quote, that could be assimilated, as opposed to prevailing racial liberal discourses of pathology, cultures of poverty, failed patriarchy, psychic trauma, and alienation. These narratives of pathology were mobilized by public officials and private entrepreneurs and developers to remove populations and redevelop the city, while community activists rewrote such narratives, critiquing capitalist, racist, and heterosexist discourses of the propertied and powerful towards an ordered disorder where people had the care, support, basic material needs, and protection they needed to thrive. And there was a really interesting intersection of like religious groups that were also working in the Tenderloin at this time on gay rights, and gay religious groups that were also working on rights together. So there's a really interesting thing happening there. And so, there's a close-up. And I think it's interesting how this picture had functioned in two very different contexts, right? So there's the Berkeley Barb, as well as the print that we see upstairs. And also just looking through some of these old 70s newsletters and magazines and things, I was just so struck by the internationalism that was present in all of them, and sort of the larger radical landscape of the political agenda, where all sorts of things were covered, as well as really great sex ads and things like that. So back on Lion Street, the White Panthers showed up to support the tenants. After the tenants had called the police because the landlord, Arden Danekas, had broken into a number of apartments to change the locks. The White Panthers were originally started in Michigan, but were of course inspired by the Black Panther Party of Self-Defense, which was started across the bay in Oakland in 1966. It is also, of course, ironic and telling that the tenants called the police and the White Panthers when the Black Panthers were created to protect Black communities from the police. And this is just an image from, I'm trying to remember which print this was. But this is from one of these religious groups in the Tenderloin that was doing a lot of work. And so the White Panthers ran this thing called the Food Conspiracy, which is essentially like a cooperative in a way, where they pulled together, bought a lot of things wholesale, and then redistributed it to the community, so it was much more affordable. Oh yes, and this was a part of the Crusader newspaper, so there's this ad in there. So in this way, there is continued relevance to Hal's eviction print that makes it a critical snapshot of 1975 as much as a foreshadowing of 2021, the tragedy and the farce. In a recent book, journalist Connor Doherty writes that, quote, "A growing affordable housing crisis sits at the center of every major American problem," end quote. For anyone who has visited the Bay Area in the last few years, it is plain to see that the Bay Area is one of its crucial epicenters, wishfully an anomaly, but most likely a harbinger of things to come across the nation. Doherty goes on to say that, quote, "It's impossible to talk about racism without talking about segregation, and it's impossible to talk about segregation without talking about housing." So one of the longest and well-known struggles against eviction in San Francisco was happening at the same time as Fischer was organizing his neighbors. As part of the urban renewal of downtown, the city proposed to demolish 10 city blocks that comprised Manila Town, an area between Chinatown, North Beach, and the developing financial district of downtown. The center of this neighborhood of low-cost housing, mostly SROs, single residency occupancy buildings, restaurants, barbershops, markets, clubs, and businesses for the mostly Filipino residents, was the International Hotel, where Asian workers had begun moving into in the 1920s and 30s. And also, they used to speak of the Tenderloin as the white ghetto, but it was also, there were a lot of Filipinos and Latinx and some Black folks there as well, but the majority were white residents. And so, in the theme of confrontations, right, this is another confrontation in which the San Francisco police are getting up in the protesters who are trying to protect the International Hotel. The real estate company Milton Meyer and Company issued evictions in 1968 so that they could tear down the building and build a parking lot. The Asian American activist community coalesced around the building's residents, and the movement around saving the I Hotel brought together students and activists from across the Bay Area, from the Black Panthers, American Indian Movement, Chicano organizations, the Bay Area Gay Liberation, and even the People's Temple. The Milton Meyer and Company eventually sold the I Hotel to the Thailand-based Four Seas Investment Corporation. The city eventually evicted the remaining 55 elderly residents of the original 197 evicted in 1977. For decades, the demolished blocks sat undeveloped, surrounded by a chain-linked fence. a bitter reminder of the political move to remove people in the name of a renewal that did not need to happen. So community organizing and pressure continued, such that when a building was rebuilt in the early 2000s, it was now 104 apartments of senior housing called the International Hotel Manila Town Center. And I think the iHotel is really emblematic of the kind of work that was being done in terms of like urban renewal and development in San Francisco at the time. And it also demonstrates the wasteful use of people's power and energy to basically tear something down, leave it empty, and then basically rebuild what was needed again. And and by that time, of course, the elderly residents got first shot at the new apartments, but most of them had passed on by then. And so this returns us to an idea about San Francisco as refuge, forcing us to ask about what is refuge and what kind of refuge and Mecca is it and for whom. For Jenna Green, a Black writer who moved to San Francisco from the South, the image of the gentrifying 21st century tech bros is consistent with a history in which San Francisco was, quote, full of self-assured white people who possess the righteous confidence that comes with believing you're on the forefront of progress, end quote. Yes, and also not, as Fischer's work shows. Yes, on the forefront of progress, but also willing to risk, encounter, and be uncomfortable, to actually be less than self-assured, right? To risk for others is when gay activism in SF included anti-imperialist activism in Central and South America, or to organize with labor, partially as teachers in SF public schools, which Tom Amiano, the first openly gay supervisor, had been a teacher and was a big part of that movement. So Rebecca Solnit reminds us that, quote, the progressive version of San Francisco also squeezes out people and institutions. Americans tend to mistake powerlessness for innocence because both are without impact. But we come to know later how powerlessness and innocence aren't that close together in that way. At a 1970s protest, a man carried the sign, a gay landlord is still a landlord. And we can apply that today to all sorts of groups who are landlords and may come from, historically underrepresented or marginalized groups. Similarly, when artists advocated for live-work spaces in the industrial spaces of South of Market, they unintentionally ushered in the loosening of restrictions that led to the development of luxury condos and the lessening of industrial working class jobs and affordable housing that the city so desperately needed. When power has been acquired, an impact is indeed made. And as Savannah Shange asks of seemingly progressive victories in the city, what do we lose when we win? And I think I'm probably gonna end there with that question. Yeah.
Thank you, Maryam. That was a fabulous paper, and you made me intensely nostalgic for San Francisco, but also reminded me about, made me question what it is I'm nostalgic for, right? And what's at stake in that. And I love your reading of the eviction image. Comments, questions? Question from Hal Fischer.
Maryam, that was great. And I've been grappling with something. Probably should look at my own work more because I forgot something. The curator at the Addison was writing something about Castro Street, and he talked about gentrification, and I probably incorrectly called him out on it. And I guess the one question is does the word gentrification automatically imply something negative? And the reason I ask that, because what I was pointing out to him is the migration came from gays from the Haight-Ashbury to the Castro, but it came with a lot of gays starting to buy houses because lower and middle income, particularly Irish American families, were leaving. So people weren't being pushed out initially. They were going to the suburbs in terms of what was happening in a lot of cities in America. And then I see my piece and I go, oh shit, here I am talking about these old men don't have any place to go anymore. So it's really complicated. I'd love to have your insights on it because I might be screwed up.
Yeah, I think gentrification usually has a really negative connotation. I think it's also just actually a description of a process, right? And I think the Castro, it was like yes and no, right? So there were people who could like afford to leave and like moved out to the suburbs or to the Sunset or the Richmond and things like that. And then there were people who got stuck there, right? And I think, and so then do the property taxes go up? Do the property values go up? Do they lose their sort of cultural, environment? Do they gain something, right? Because that's also part of the process of gentrification for those who are able to stay. So I think it's a complicated process, right? That's very nuanced, and we tend to oversimplify it. And also, Jeff Chang says in his book, We Gonna Be All Right, that gentrification is also a really incomplete term for that process because it only talks about the people who manage to stay. It doesn't talk about what happens when people leave and where they go. Right. So, in his book, he talks about how the Black population of San Francisco is dispersed, right, to the outer parts of the Bay Area, or a lot of people have returned to the South. This is also happening in Chicago. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question. Yeah, it does. Okay, good. Yeah, but I was actually so struck by how that caption could be applied to today.
I'd forgotten it. I was struck too.
Yeah. You're like, hey.
I wish Antoinette Burton was still here because when she and I walked around the exhibition upstairs, she looked at the street fashion photographs and she said, we stopped talking about the human figure and she was focusing on what's in the background, right? That is all the marks of the moment, right? The urban marks, the marks of posters for various kinds of gatherings, various kinds of political activism. And she said, I want to see what's on those posters. She said, you're going to hate this, but these photographs are social history, right? And I think that what you have shown us is some of that social history, and you've shown us the way it's inscribed in the photographs, right? And I'm just I'm just thinking aloud while people come up with their questions, but the social history and the more than social history that is inscribed in the photographs, are we somehow distracted from it or given permissions to overlook it by focusing on the kind of often staged male figures in the photographs, right? I don't know. Do you have any thoughts about that? There's multiple things going on in individual photographs, and what you've shown us is not something we see immediately. And that strikes me as very important.
Yeah. So I'm going to quote one of my old film professors, Tom Anderson. I'm going to paraphrase, actually. So he talks about, when we look at fiction films, they're actually a documentary, right, is happening in the background, but we're paying attention to the foreground narrative. And similarly, that when we watch documentaries, there's actually quite a lot of fiction in them. And I think maybe that could also apply here, right? There's a kind of staging that's happening that's more, I don't know how I'm going to classify the staging, right? But it's performative. But there is a lot that's happening that we can think about as historical evidence. And that's, that's my interest in the works too, right? Like I didn't even get to talk about, the ERA and the little symbols there. And then I think it says Viva la Socialist Revolution, right? So like there's a lot happening in these photographs. Yeah, so I think it goes back to your earlier comment about how we commemorate Hal Fischer's work, right? Like what gets remarked upon. And I think there's just a lot there that I'm feeling good about being able to see it and look at it and feel very nice. Yeah.
Question from Terry Weissman.
I'm also just sort of thinking out loud while people think about this, but I really just so much appreciate how you're framing it and also expanding. I mean, really, this is what you were saying or what Antoinette was saying, expanding what we're seeing when we're looking at the pictures in a way that's super important. And I'm wondering if you can talk. So I was really both related to and touched when you were saying that even though you were like, where are the like, well, really, there's only like white gay guys in like all of Castro.
Yeah.
But yet you still felt like it was coming home in some sort of way. Like I had a kind of similar feeling. Like, so I'm wondering if you can think or if you have any thoughts on not just like the eviction notice, but eviction image, but also in all of the images, is there something like, can you identify a quality, what it is about them that allows for that kind of access to both an access to like others, like that is, a culture that isn't yours, that isn't exclusionary in some way, or doesn't have like, what is it in the actual images, I guess, if you know.
I mean, I think it is a combination of what's in the images and how I'm approaching them too, based on sort of what I said about how that culture also is a part of me because of proximity and being a part of it and having a lot of, connections to it.
But presumably, right, there could be images.
It could, I see what you're saying.
Sorry.
Yeah.
That there could be images that are also of that same space and of that same moment that don't allow you to still approach it with that kind of openness. I don't have, I mean, I'm just curious about this.
So I think part of it is about what I see in terms of the questioning approach, right? Of how Hal is approaching his subject matter, right? And bringing with it the humor. I think humor is a huge entry point, but also there's a tenderness and vulnerability in there as well that I see. I don't want to say it's like universal or whatever, but I do think that his, like, the classification is playful. It's not overdetermined. And I see something in that, like the Boyfriend series, right? Like the personal narrative, the angst, the unknowing, the joy, the pain, the whatever, like all of that is there, and I think it's apparent. And I agree that not every kind of work that perhaps had the same images would convey that. I also, and this is where I don't know if I'm too precious about San Francisco or not, but there is I feel like there's a particularity of a lot of different kinds of people being stuck on a very tiny peninsula, where you are forced to deal with each other. And I think that's similar to like the New York subway, right? Like you are forced to be in relationship. And I remember when we were young, my friends and I who dated men were like, we prefer men from San Francisco because they just don't have the hang-ups around homosexuality that other men have, because it's just a matter of fact. We grew up around it, and so it was just part of everyday life. And so I don't know if that is a satisfactory answer. I think there is maybe something I need to think more about what it was precisely that when I saw the photographs, I was like, I want to think about these. I want to be near these. I want to look at these more, because I could have had a different, And I think the angst of not seeing more diversity was part of our experience, right? It was part of our critique of what was happening in the Castro, what was happening at the Pride parades, right? So that was also part of our experience, right?
Question from Jeannie Brinkema, who after 20 years, I'm still practicing the pronunciation of her name.
So I love this, and I wanted to venture just an interpretation of what you're saying and then see if it holds water. I hear you offering a kind of really robust critique of empathy as a ground for political identification. And I heard this in a few places. I was just sort of curious to hear your thoughts on it. I loved the paragraph that you read from the Duke book, right? About, again, this sort of like assemblage, but it was a kind of like set of asymmetrical ways that identity can kind of accumulate and assemble. I hear it in the way you described his work in part as cinematic, and having this kind of voiceover sort of logic. I hear it in the cast of characters that turns this into a tableau. In other words, a kind of logic in his work and also in your thinking that is against like empathetic identification as a ground of solidarity. And it seemed to come up as a kind of political claim when you talked about sort of acting on behalf of others, such that minoritarian sort of politics always implies acting for the thing that you don't see yourself in. Such that not seeing yourself actually becomes the opening of political engagement instead of a closing down, which I would take to be part of a kind of contemporary critique of empathy. What do you think? Does that hold water? Am I sort of hearing that right?
Like, yes. Okay. Yeah. No, I think the empathy politics, politics of representation, which is important, I think, but the over-identitarianness of what our human capacities are can be very limiting. Is that in line, I think, with what you're saying?
Yeah, and I'm curious how it relates to these formal problems that you so beautifully articulated.
Can you say more about the formal problems?
I think for me, part of it has to do with that sort of second clause that titles this tableau, right? There's cast of characters in order of appearance. Well, the order of appearance is strange in a tableau that's presented all at once, right? The order of appearance is to my phenomenological movement through the tableau, which is purely abstractly done by number. And the number could, of course, apply to any of them. There's no reason that the officer dead center of the image isn't one, right? It's an arbitrary system that makes them appear to me in a certain order, that makes other ones recede, right? The arbitrariness of number is what gives them a kind of narrative. So there's this multiple sort of evacuation of a documentary immediate attestation. And for me, it's about a kind of unfolding reading. So I feel like part of it is, again, also about the sort of like lack of immediacy, a lack of recognition actually being the opening to a kind of political potential, which I also heard in that accumulation that just kept going in this really beautiful and poetic way in your own sort of thinking about it.
Yeah, I think one of the things I've been thinking through is what are our culpabilities and commitments to people just by virtue of proximity, right? Just in terms of, a number of scholars talk about this as like grounded relationality, right? And so how we are put in relation, and then we must deal with those relations because we are together in this place. And I think this is an example of that, for sure, right? That we are in relationship, but then there's all these other people who are in relationship to this image who aren't there as well. And we offer, and I'm offering a critique, right, of some of these cast of characters. I even looked up Officer Batajlia too. He retired about 20 years ago. But that's also about the smallness of San Francisco, right? That we are all I am probably one or two people removed from everyone in that picture, just by virtue of growing up in the city. And so we are in relationship to each other. And I think oftentimes we are cast out of those relations. And so my work right now has been really thinking about how we cast each other back in to those relations, if that makes sense. Because we kind of have to, because the trees are all going to burn otherwise. Yeah, we have to be more expansive, basically.
The work you do in this paper, I mean, what you just presented to us does that work of casting us, I mean, it performs that work of casting us back into relation in a way that I really appreciate. I keep looking at people who've come from San Francisco and people who love San Francisco to see what I feel there's a question bubbling, but maybe not. Maybe there's a poem bubbling rather than a question. I don't know.
I mean, I think I heard it in the poem, right? Like there was that culpability and connection and relation that is much wider than we sometimes see when we just look at the figure of gay semiotics. Right?
Maryam, that was a fantastic paper and a great conversation. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.